Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Hey, welcome back to Agriculture in a Nutshell. I'm going to talk today about a specific crop, probably the largest crop grown in United States in terms of acreage, and it's corn. Corn has many uses and is grown in a lot of different conditions, but the plant essentially takes the same type of fertility program to be successful with it. Corn is harvested for grain, but it's also harvested as a livestock feed in the form of silage, which is taken a plant that's about at 68 to 70% moisture when it's harvested and put into a pit and then siled, meaning it's basically stabilized and capturing all of the fruit so it doesn't turn to alcohol, and basically makes a great feed for dairy cows in particular, but any livestock. And that silage, that ensiling process, is interesting in its own way, but we're going to stick more to the fertility today. But we'll talk about, like I say, one of the most important crops we grow in the United States, which is corn. And if you've listened to a lot of the previous podcasts, one of the things you'll know is it's important to take a good soil sample before we begin our fertility program.
Bill's going to get into talking about why it's so important to know what's in your soil before you start growing corn, and for that matter, any crop.
Well, why is that? First, we don't know what to add if we don't know what's missing. So if we haven't got any history of this crop, and we're going to look at what did the previous crop take away, and then what's missing or what was missing from the last year, and what did our tissues tell us that we were short of, so that if we're not taking all that information to improve on, we're going to get similar results. And we're always looking for what? Better and better production and more economical ways to fertilize to produce the biggest crop with the fewest inputs, or a bigger crop, and we don't mind that we had to put more into inputs because the increase in the total crop that we harvested more than made up of any additional expense. So a lot of things go into a fertility plan, and can really never talk about every single possibility, because basically the possibilities are infinite depending on your irrigation, depending on what crops or what nutrients are available to you to use. How often are you a dry land where you're irrigating, or your irrigation is strictly rainfall? Or do you have control of your irrigation? Or do you have a heavy soil? Do you have a light sandy soil? All of these things. So to come up with a crop-specific fertility plan, I'm almost always going to talk in generality.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about one of the most important nutrients to start off with any crop, which is, if you've been watching our other episodes, nitrogen.
But every crop is going to need a lot of what I'm talking about in all the different nutrients we talk about. So as almost all crops that I always like to talk about, and the fertility plans that we want to put together, we kind of started all with nitrogen, because it's one of those things, even though it's hard to say it's not the most important nutrient, but it always comes back to, if you will have to put some nitrogen on every crop to make it anywhere close to the best it could possibly be. And one of the things about planting a grain crop like corn is we want to start with something to pre-plant. And I like to put a nitrogen that's an ammonium-based nitrogen pre-plant into my, which is a broadcast, or depending on how your irrigation set up, is it down the row, but trying to place that nitrogen where it needs to be applied before we get an irrigation or we get a rain on it, incorporate that, and now we're going to be going back out there ready to plant. And the fertilizer I like to use most times is a couple 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate, because ammonium is a non-leachable form until it converts to nitrate. So if we do get water on it, if we're in a place where it's strictly rainfall or a high rainfall area, we can put our nitrogen on and hold on to it, not lose it. And that's important because it's all expensive. And if it goes past our root zone down 10, 12 inches, we're not able to pick it up. And we basically put on an application that we get very little from. Also normal, almost everywhere you go. A good thing that goes with ammonium is the sulfate, the sulfur. If you've went through a season or went through a winter where you've had a lot of snow, if you've had a lot of rainfall, and you have pushed a lot of that sulfur out of that, you're starting with an empty pot there, an empty bank of sulfur for nutrition. So we're starting with a nitrogen that's hard to leach and a sulfur that you're probably deficient of starting every year. So you're starting with two of the four most important nutrients, particularly in terms of volume: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. So when we've got 200 pounds of ammonium sulfate, which will basically give you about 42 pounds of nitrogen and about 48 pounds of sulfur. So that's a really good starting point. Then the next thing we're going to do, and with corn particularly, it's almost always planted with a seeded crop. So we're going to plant the seed into that.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about a starter fertilizer for corn.
And because of a seed crop, I've never seen a seeded crop of any type that doesn't do better with some form of what we call starter fertilizer. And normally with that starter fertilizer, we're doing a nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium material. Those three, the big three, and now we also have our sulfur already applied. So we've got kind of starting with 4 of those big building blocks. So as you talk about that starter, we don't need a lot of nitrogen early on, but we do want it to get in some, so we get that initial cell division. Plus you also have this ammonium sulfate that you've got out there to get into and begin to get that plant to pick it up and start to, once it germinates, it's got to break that plumule and get it out of the soil so they can begin the photosynthetic reaction, and then that's what we need to continue stimulate roots. It's roots and the energy within that cell, that seed, pushing it, the plumule out, photosynthesis, and then the roots seeking more nutrition. And a lot of the good starters are about a 3-to-1 mix of, start with 1 part of nitrogen, 3 parts of phosphate, and then another 1/2 to 2 parts of potassium to nitrogen. So in other words, some of the numbers that are used extensively, and we see them a lot, you'll see an 8-24-3 is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, or a 4-10-10 blend of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. And the reason it's so important to get a starter fertilizer, because the sooner, particularly on phosphate, that root that emerges from that seed gets into phosphorus, the faster it's going to take off and grow. And it's going to get that plumule pushed through there. So a lot of the nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium products can be toxic to very, very tender roots. So it needs to be put in and applied 2 inches down from the seed and 2 inches over. So when you're setting up your planter, you're putting your seed at one depth and you're putting your NPK starter fertilizer down. Some people also like a little micronutrient package, which is fine, or they may want to put in some other products that they believe. We're seeing some people with organic acids putting at cell and helping to get more nutrition into it faster. But the basic building block is that NPK mix that we're putting. Now that will burn those tender roots, so it needs to get a little toughness built up in those roots to go over and out. Once it gets in there, we get a good reaction. Some of the newer chemistries are really exciting because they have a real low salt index, and you're literally almost able to put that starter fertilizer right on the seed itself. And as that emerges, because it doesn't really have much, if any, toxicity, that root can get right into it. And I have seen some of these, particular put in real close proximity to the seed, be able to emerge in 2 to 3 days. We broke ground. And the sooner we get it started, because it got into phosphate and those roots begin to extend and that plumule speeds up how fast it emerges, might make a huge difference on a real hot time when you're trying to get that seed to emerge and it's going through a very, very hot soil, or it's out and growing ahead of when some hot weather was coming. So it has some real big advantages. The other thing too is it's a fairly pricey material, but the volume is not needed. So particularly we'll hear people putting, of these newer type products, 3 to 5 gallons and sometimes less, but 3 to 5 gallons is kind of a normal amount that you would put on. Something like a 41010, which is kind of a product that we've seen a lot for years. They'll put at least 10 gallons and maybe 20 or 40 gallons I've seen people put on. And because of that, you got a lot more volume of product, but you've got just as much probably invested in your initial, and that doesn't mean you get a whole lot more efficient of it. So it's kind of what you're set up for. I really am high on a lot of these others because I think it allows your plant to get that good start. It's difficult to make up for a poor start.
Now Bill's going to talk about silage and grain corn.
So now it's good to also understand, and where I come from in California, a lot of the corn ground that we see put in is on dairies, and it's used for silage. But a good silage corn is a good grain corn. Maybe you want a little lower statured plant in your corn, but what you're really looking for, whether it's silage or for grain, is you're looking for a lot of grain in that. Your percentage of grain in a good silage corn is 50% grain and 50% stalk. And when you see some of these stalks that are 12 to 14 foot high, it's difficult to imagine that ear we take off has the same weight as that stalk. But I've done a lot of trials, and the best crops were always about a 50 to 50 grain to stalk ratio. So we need to be growing both products. But you can't supply the grain if you don't have a good, efficient stalk. So we can't ignore the stalk when we're looking at a grain corn either. But we want them on both. The sooner they can get into that phosphate and nitrogen and potassium, the sooner they're going to emerge, which is going to allow them to probably be at the peak of reproduction. We don't want them delaying just getting going, because ultimately we're trying to maximize production. The corn is going to emerge and produce based on the fertility that's presented to it. So these dairy crops, for these silage, we see lots and lots of heavy phosphate, which is from the application of manures and lagoons being put out onto their fields, as they empty it in from the barn, running all the water off and putting that manure and that liquid slurry even that's put out now by pumping out the lagoons and then putting it out there, has a lot of phosphate. And that's because why? Because of the diet of the cows that do that. A lot of phosphate in alfalfa hay, a lot of phosphate in that corn plant. And so therefore there's a lot of it, guess what, in the manure. And so while we're doing this, a lot of people don't think we need any phosphate. But I've always told people, if you don't think phosphate's doing you any good, on your planter, take the outside, liquid dropper that's putting it down there, or dry if you're using a dry fertilizer, and pinch it off, and then make a few rounds. And then what you'll get is that those rows, the outside row will, as you turn and come back, you're going to put 2 rows together that didn't get any fertilizer. And I guarantee you, when it emerges and comes up and is about a foot tall, you're saying, I see what it did. It got it moving faster and quicker, and it ultimately is going to be a whole lot more productive, even though after it gets to be 4 to 6 feet high, it kind of catches up. It will never catch up from a standpoint of the actual crop that you harvest. The crop will look similar, but it will not yield like it did on the others. So that's why I don't suggest you do the whole field. It's better just do a section and convince yourself, because that seeded crop without a starter will always underperform as to what one will do with a starter fertilizer. And that's almost on any seeded crop that you plant. So next, after you've got that, and nitrogen, there's plenty of tables that tell you if you're growing grain, it's about 1.25 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn that you produce. And you can do the math on silage, but it's easy if you figure that we're going to produce this much grain and then make sure that you get out. Now, we already are starting with somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 pounds, and then you're adding some here at the starter. And then depending on how you can get into your field, you're either going to look at side dressing, you're going to look at running it through your irrigation system, you're going to run it through your furrows. A lot of ways to apply nitrogen to your crop to get the total units. It could be as much as 200, 250, depending on what your yield goal is. You will need to put the proper amount of nitrogen on. Plenty of tables to look that up. One of the things about corn that's so good is there is so much research done on corn, and we're going to talk about some other nutrients that really can let you use maybe less nitrogen than you're using if you've got your soil balanced. But you're going to need that proper amount, and then spread it out over as much as you can between those. Because I know a lot of guys that will put out a pre-plant, their starter, and they'll side dress the balance of their nitrogen at that point. Not the most efficient way, because as that nitrate fertilizer will leach, because as it converts from ammonium to nitrate, it becomes leachable and moves through it, your efficiency goes way down. So we want to get it in as much as possible, because anything that goes down past that 10, 12 inches is not going to be plant available at all. And it'll go on through, and so you've put it on. And one of the things people don't see is that our eyes fool us, because we look at that nitrogen, and I know if I'm applying it and I've got tail water or that water's going somewhere, rather than worrying about taking that tail water and return it, or as I'm putting it on my irrigation system and I'm getting it out there, the thing that you don't notice is if you side dress a whole bunch at one time, you don't see it leave. And that our eyes fool us in that regard, because we know we put it there, so therefore I put enough nitrogen, but yet we will see that plant run out of nitrogen at the end. And normally I always like to get just a little bit of nitrogen at tasseling, somewhere around maybe 10% of the total right then, and that would be the last time, because anything after that wouldn't be effective for that corn plant's metabolic process. Nitrogen is really, I talk about it easy, but easy to find and see what those are. A lot of people will look for just the classic yellowing of leaves. I don't have enough. That can fool you. There can be other nutrients that aren't there, and that's what that yellowing's coming. But one of the things you can do, that plant will try to reproduce itself regardless. Silage, grain corn, doesn't make any difference. And when you start to see the bottom leaves start to fire, meaning turn yellow, everything else is green, and the very bottom leaves start to fire and become basically from anywhere from yellow to then basically taking everything from it, because what it's doing is grabbing the nitrogen it needs for the reproductive cycle that's coming. So when you see those bottom leaves begin to fire or start to dry up, another application of nitrogen can green them back up, because all of a sudden now it doesn't need to cannibalize itself to get enough nitrogen to do its reproductive function. And the more you starve it, the more those leaves will fire, and you'll just keep coming up that stalk and have, you may get your grain to fill out, but it will never be as productive as it would be if we kept the proper amount of nitrogen there. It also is a good indicator, am I putting too much? And if I don't see any firing, then I may be over applying, which essentially is just wasting money. So it's another good location to look to be able to tell you how much nitrogen maybe I should have applied, or how much I was short, and just trying to fine tune it to maximize our efficiency of nitrogen.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about why it's so important to have your calcium and magnesium levels properly sorted.
Another thing that's really important for the efficiency of nitrogen is where our calcium and magnesium ratio is. And back to our soil samples that I talked about earlier, getting the base saturation of our soils to somewhere around a 65 to 68 to a 10 to 12, 13% magnesium is where we want for our soils to be balanced, to increase the porosity, the airspace, the soil structure that we really want for maximum production. And what that also does is it increases our nitrogen efficiency by a lot. I've done a lot of crops, and corn being one of them, where our magnesium's too high and our calcium's too low, and we find that our efficiency may only be 70%. The amount of it, so every 100 pounds of nitrogen I put on, I lose 30% of it. Whereas if we have a good balance of where calcium and magnesium need to be, we can get 90 to 95% efficient. So you're throwing that extra nitrogen on and you're sometimes not even getting it in the plant. And so you're spending the money without the result. And that's really not something you can do forever. You need to figure out what you need to do to make it. And one of those things is getting your calcium and magnesium in balance, to let the microbial activity and that porosity and that airspace you're creating in your soil to basically be able to deliver those nutrients to your crop. Magnesium, of course, is also, and if you can imagine how much leaf surface on a mature corn crop is out there, the proper amount of magnesium needs to be there to do photosynthesis. On the other side, calcium, really super important for filling cells and gluing cells together in that growth process, that we have adequate nitrogen to get their cell division going. If we're short of calcium, then we begin to slow down that cell division because we're not filling the cells like we should with that calcium material into the vacuoles inside that cell, and then enough to actually hold those cells together in the form of calcium pectate to glue those cell walls together. Okay.
Now Bill's going to go into talking about potassium.
So that gives you kind of calcium, magnesium, and phosphate, and nitrogen. Now let's look at potassium. Anybody that grows any crop these days always struggles to keep the proper amount of potassium there. And it isn't that we don't want to do that. Economically, can we make it work? And economics, and that's why most people underapply potassium, is because of the cost of it. It's a very expensive nutrient for the amount we have to apply. So, a lot of our dairy guys have a really good potassium because, again, with what they're feeding, that returns, particularly if you're feeding alfalfa hay, and the amount of potassium that goes into that and the excess that goes out through the manure and back to your fields, it keeps that potassium high. The problem is that if you're growing alfalfa on a rotation, you suck all that extra potassium out because it takes it all to grow that alfalfa. So what you're needing to do is try to do, and again, it's soil sampling and soil testing and trusting those numbers after you do them for several years to give you the proper ability to put on the right amount of potassium to get your crop to the end. The sandier the soil, the higher the percentage, but you need the pounds there, somewhere around 450 to 550 of total pounds of potassium in that soil to be able to grow a good corn crop. If you're in a base saturation situation, you want to get at least over 5%, and that'll do it. Even in some of your heavier soils, if you just don't have the bank to be able to put on the amount of potassium, at least get it to 3 to 4%. And you're going to find that it does a whole lot better because that potassium, in addition to be there for cell wall strength, to give your crop the ability to be the standability that you really need in that corn crop, but it also is a huge stress reliever. When you get long periods of very hot, dry temperature, the ability of potassium to give that crop the ability to handle that stress has been proven many, many times. The people that have got enough potassium in those hot, dry summers, say in the Midwest, where you've got a lot of, it's just by rainfall, and we've had a long period of no rainfall, very high temperatures, and yet those ones that have adequate potassium are the ones that rebound when the rain finally hits, that are able to handle that stress of a hot, dry summer, and that really pays dividends when you get to the crop. Because when everybody else is struggling, because you're waiting for rainfall, and a lot of people's crop, their yields are way down, that potassium probably more than paid up for it, because price a lot of times with low yields returns, and you're able to be more successful, because it's not how much you put on, it's how much you harvest and how much that harvest pays you back. I always like to tell people that a lot of something that's very low priced is better than a little of something that's low price. And so you're not going to always save yourself into prosperity. So we need to do with a budget, and we need to effectively know what our yield goal is and need to know what's in that soil, so we know everything we put on has to be maximum efficiency so that we're making a profit at the end.
Now Bill's going to talk a little bit more about micronutrients.
Micronutrients then, boron, because whether I talked about that earlier, whether you're doing grain corn or silage corn, you're worried about the grain. And that goes back to pollination. And one of the most important nutrients for pollination is boron. And boron's very easy to work with. It doesn't take a lot. It only needs to be at 1.5 to 2 parts per million in your soil, which equates to somewhere between 3 and 4 pounds of boron in that top, aerobic zone of 6-7 inches. Okay. One of the things about boron, though, if you don't have a good level of calcium and at least 65% base saturation or more, and then when it gets hot and dry, you can actually do damage to your corn, because it'll actually be toxic, because it doesn't allow, the calcium is the controller. It'll allow it to basically be in your tissue, but not basically pull all the nutrients from it and fry it and actually be toxic to it. And so a lot of people, it's gotten a bad rap. One of the things you really need to do and look at it is make sure that you have high calcium numbers. And if you do, boron becomes less toxic, if toxic at all. And so the key is you can't do one without the other. If you don't have the money or you've got low calcium, then be very, very, very careful with boron. But somewhere, like I say, keeping you somewhere around at least 1%, you'll be deficient below 0.8 parts per million. At 1 part per million is a good lower number, 1.5 to 2 on the high end. If you have lots of available calcium, you want to push it to higher, because it will improve pollination. But the other thing that boron does is it transfers starch from the leaves and puts it into the grain. And so what that does is it builds up nutrients. It makes your bushel weights higher. So boron has a lot of effect that it can have on your ending crop, which is that grain portion of it. Iron, of course, very, very important for that dark green color that attracts sunlight, makes photosynthesis really work, and also basically is essential to keep that plant in a good health situation through its growing time. It's probably one of the least applied nutrients of the micronutrients. But if you're always running a little shy but not bad, iron and some of the other micronutrients work really well as foliar. So if you're going through an aerial crop of some insecticide or something like that, it's easy and fairly efficient and economical to put on some foliars. I really suggest that on the micronutrients, because they are micro, which means it doesn't need a lot to truly be a big effect on that crop. Next is manganese, really important for the production of lignin. Anybody that knows corn knows that low lignin varieties have a hard time standing. Low lignin varieties with low manganese levels will have a hard time ever standing up the way you want them. So we like the low lignin for digestibility, but we have to have some there to have standability. So manganese really the key to that, because we got to have it for the formation of lignin. And it's easy to be low in manganese. If you are, you might want to do a little bit when you apply in the soil, and then make sure it's in your foliar when you foliar apply your micronutrients. The other thing I found with any crop, and that's across the board, the micronutrients always work better in combination. There's a synergy when you put them together for foliar application of, particularly iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. Those 4 put in there to make sure that they work better together. So if I'm short of one, that's the highest percentage of my mix that I'd want. Maybe I want something that's a 5% manganese and a 0.5% iron, because I've got plenty of iron, and maybe a 2% zinc and a 1% copper. It could vary, these numbers, based on what those tissues are telling you from previous years, and also what those soils are telling you. So we have manganese for that lignin and also for setting grain on kernels, individual kernels, as we talk about. I didn't say it when I was talking about boron, but I wanted to add one thing. Remember, every one of those silk is basically has to have that pollen delivered to every one of those kernels to get pollinated to make a kernel on that cob. So that's why boron becomes another reason it becomes so effective. We've got to get all of those silks pollinated and travel down to make sure we fill out that we don't have any blanks on that ear of corn. Copper, another good one for resilience. When it gets hot and gets a little droopy, it will come back quicker if you have good copper levels. Your fungal diseases will be less of a problem if you've got really good copper numbers, because it's a natural fungicide that's in plants. Also, zinc, which everyone likes to apply, has a lot of good values, but really what it does is it's the transporter, what I like to call. Transport nutrients all throughout particularly across the leaf surface, and gets those nutrients in the plant to effectively make healthy plants, so that photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration all work at maximum. So it gives you an idea on timing, how you spread out those NPK and S's, and then when those micronutrients are available, either pre-plant or down during the growing of the crop on foliars. The pounds, though, the other big nutrients got to come from, I always say, have to come from the soil. Foliar won't catch up to those, so make sure you're getting those out early, because remember, when you apply a nutrient, it isn't into the plant the next day, and it isn't up to the top of that 8 or 10 foot tall corn plant or higher. So you have to have some, have it ahead of when that plant is actually needing it. So earlier, our eyes can have a trick. We can say, this doesn't look good, so I'm going to apply this on. You waited too long. The way you make a plant look good all the time is get that nutrient on as early as possible in that growing season, so it never starves for any of these nutrients. You'll have, I think, an increase in yields if you'll look and use the tools we have between foliage testing and the foliars that we can apply, the soil samples and the heavy products, the NPKs, calcium, magnesium, make sure our soil's balanced so that's ready to perform the way we want. We have a lot of money invested in seed, and to get the maximum out of that seed, we got to maximize our fertility. So hopefully this is helpful, at least to getting started. There are so many different scenarios. I can't go through them all, but hopefully this will get you to look into your program just a little bit better. Thanks. Until next time.
Thanks for another absolutely fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure that everyone listening thoroughly enjoyed what you had to say about how to properly facilitate the good production of corn. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.